Welcome to the Legal Insurrection Podcast. Today is January 2nd, and this is episode 18, if you can believe that. Seems like a lot more episodes than I remember recording. I'm Kimberly Kay.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I'm telling you right now. I don't believe it.
I know. It's crazy, right? But if you're just joining us, I'm Kimberly Kay, and I'm the editorial and operations director of the Legal Insurrection Foundation, and I'm here with our fearless leader, our president and founder, Professor Jacobson, ready to start off a new year. So before we jump into headlines and news of the day, how was your holiday? Did y'all have a good holiday and a good quasi break?
Yeah, it's we just hung around, nothing special, and seemed to just fly by. It was very strange having it in the middle of the week, both Christmas Day and Hanukkah night and New Year's. Just made it very disjointed. But yeah, mostly relaxing.
Yeah, it was pretty low key here too. Um, Very small, very quiet, lots of days full of no changing out of jammies and way too many snacks, and it was really nice though. But I'm really ready to get back to it and get back to our schedule and all the things we need to do. I'm very lost in time and space right now. So I'm looking forward to that. But it was nice. So thankfully it wasn't an insanely crazy news cycle. I mean, I guess it always kind of is in some way, minus yesterday and all of the attacks that happened yesterday. So why don't we start there? There was a major attack in New Orleans yesterday on New Year's Day. And we had multiple terrorist attacks, domestic attacks yesterday, which of course is very concerning. But let's start with New Orleans. Do you want to fill people in a little bit if they're not familiar? Let's just say they've been in a cocoon the last week. Like,
Yeah, if you've been on top of a mountain without
yeah.
any cell coverage, uh, there was what by all appearances was a deliberate car ramming attack on New Orleans in I think it was Bourbon Street or one of the crowded streets there for New Year's Eve. And it was carried out apparently by quote unquote Muslim extremist, somebody who had an ISIS flag in the car, on the car, in the car. That's a little unclear, but with him, and had posted a lot of some videos, as ISIS people frequently do when they go on suicide bombings. Their last video. Palestinian terrorists do the same thing, but ISIS, I think, is best known for that. And so this, by all intents and purposes, by all appearances, was an Islamic terrorist attack. I always caution people in these that while we may be confident of that at a general level, specific details can get very messed up in initial reporting. Things that, and I remember with the Boston Marathon, this was true, things that the media repeats as if it's true end up not being true. But there doesn't seem to be any doubt about who this guy was. Apparently, I think he was from Texas, and the people there have been interviewed, and it's a little unclear whether he was a recent convert or had been a convert for a long time. Those are the sort of details that they get reported, and then you're not sure if they're true. There was also a report that the mosque he was affiliated with in Texas sent out a message to their members not to talk to the police, and that if the FBI comes knocking, send them to CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Again, that's being reported. I believe it at this moment to be true, but as I said, a lot of times in these initial things, some facts get messed up. So that's what we know. He had been in the Army. It's a little vague as to why he left and how he left. Had been in the U.S. Army, I should say. It appears he was born in the U.S. Some people have reported he wasn't, but it appears he was born here. So this is a domestic Muslim who gets radicalized in some way while in the United States and carries out a ramming attack. If you remember, that is a favored method for Islamic terrorists. Hamas does it all the time in Israel. They're constantly at bus stops and elsewhere, ramming vehicles into people. Remember, there was the truck in France, got to be 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, where I think dozens of people were killed. So not only does he fit the profile, not only did he leave the trail, but he also used what has become a favored methodology, because while the FBI may be, or maybe they're not good at surveilling, explosive transfers and strange weapons purchases, they're not going to monitor every rental car. There are a few freaky details here that, again, are reported, not necessarily confirmed, because there was another attack that we'll get to in Nevada and Las Vegas. Apparently, they were rented from the same car company, which was not your standard. It wasn't like Avis or Hertz or something like that. And also, apparently, the perp in Nevada and the perp in Louisiana served in the same unit in the Army. It's not clear whether they were there at the same time. So there's a lot we don't know, but we do know that a radicalized domestic Muslim terrorist killed, the last I heard, it was 15 people. That might be a fluctuating number also.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And I haven't followed this closely. I was kind of trying to enjoy the last day of being somewhat unaware, but of course this is inescapable. What about I know you just mentioned it, but the Vegas terror attack, that there are some
So,
similarities and crossovers there. Or
yeah,
it
and again,
appears or
they did, uh, again, reports are fluid, let's say that. So a Tesla, um, I don't know what you would call it, not a truck really, but an SUV, whatever that model is that Tesla has.
that
There's some.
fake car thing. My kids always laugh at it anytime we see one. They're like,
Okay,
"What is
so
that? That's not even a car."
it exploded, or there was an explosion in it in front of a Trump hotel in Las Vegas. And then the initial reaction was, haha, one of Elon Musk's cars caught fire. Okay. But it became obvious pretty quickly that it didn't just catch fire. There was an explosive device in it. Elon Musk, and this is actually something you should know if you have a Tesla, because they apparently can monitor everything. They got, I guess, their electric cars send back data continuously to the satellites. So they were able to go and check whether there was any engine problem or any other, vehicular problem with it. And they were able to quickly determine that it wasn't like the car didn't catch fire. It wasn't the battery, because it would have
Mhm.
sent messages up to the, I assume, Starlink or something. And so, uh, and when they opened up the car, they found some sort of explosive devices in the back. And again, it's a little vague what it was. I've heard different descriptions of it, but somebody blew up the car in front of Trump Tower. And of course, Elon Musk is getting great publicity from it, because apparently the goal would have been to blow out the sides of the car. But apparently it is so uh, strongly constructed that the explosion was actually contained in the car and blew out the roof. So it caused no damage to the Trump building or passersby, which apparently would have been the motivation for this. They did make an arrest in it. Um, I have not seen any description of him being a Muslim or extremist. I just don't think the details have come out yet. Apparently, was a strange guy. We don't know if this was religiously motivated or politically motivated. I've heard things or seen things on Twitter that he was an extremist leftist. I don't know if that's true. I think that one we're going to need to wait on. But we have had two terror attacks in 2 days, one of which clearly was an Islamic terrorist attack. And the other one is to be determined what the motivation was. As of now, I don't know what's being reported on
It should be so much bigger of a deal than it is. I think especially post COVID. We've all been so desensitized to such terrible things on the regular, though. Um, and especially for this to happen in multiple places at once. I am not going to prognosticate on what I think that means, if that means anything, if it's coincidental. I'm not one to believe in coincidence, but that's just me, you know. I suppose anything is possible. Um, but it's a bit of a concerning way to start the year. And I don't know if it's coming from a place of desperation, you know, because things are about to change and change rapidly if Trump does everything that he's saying that he's going to do in his second and last term. So, um,
Yeah. I mean,
and
the New Orleans one is clearly, I mean, we just don't know enough about Vegas, but the New
right,
Orleans one is what people have been warning about. Okay.
yes,
That the rhetoric that's being used, the indoctrination that's been taking place online for years, the indoctrination that's taking place in mosques, the anti American rhetoric, you see videos circulating, um, is what's going to radicalize people. And
yes,
so I think that is back in the news. I mean, that, it's almost like we're back in, you know, 2002 or
right,
2001 after 9/11. That, how do you address, it's certainly true that the vast majority of American Muslims do not do these things. Um, uh, but it's also true that to the extent these things are done, they are disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately done by Muslims who've been radicalized either abroad or in mosques here or online. And
yeah,
that's something people don't want to deal with because you raise what is a legitimate issue and you're going to get called Islamophobic. Just like if you wanted to raise an issue with regard to Black Lives Matter, you get called racist. I mean, there
right.
is, and so the authorities don't want to address what is continues to be a significant problem.
Well, and I think Americans on the whole have such an insular view of so many things. If you've traveled outside of this country, if you've traveled anywhere in Europe or even other parts of the world where there is a large Islamic presence, they don't at all try to hide what their agenda is. Does everyone participate in these extremist activities? No. But a lot more people do than what anyone in our country really wants to acknowledge. Um, and, you know, it is something to be reckoned with. It is something I remember all of the fuss around 9/11 and how do you fight, you know, this is not like it's a country attacking us. That would be easy. An ideological opponent is one that's far more difficult to contend with than one that is, you know, restricted by geography. Presents a whole host of challenges. But yeah, I mean, I think you're 100% correct. It's something that I know so much of our internal wokeness has taken over our concern and the headlines and the stuff that we're contending with here, but there are external threats and external ideologies that are very real. And I think, you know, if anything, this is, I mean, I don't want to say that an attack is a reminder, but it puts this issue back in the forefront where it may have taken, you know, been put on the back burner for some of these other non-traversies, I would even call them in some ways.
And it's coming up at a critical time. And of course, you see the idiot conspiracy theories, on Twitter and elsewhere, that this was timed for a reason. But the timing is actually important because Trump is going to be rolling out his immigration plans and his
Yes.
deportation plans. And I think that this is going to factor into that. At least, I don't know if it'll change what he's planning to do, but it's going to be part of the debate. And you combine that with the protests, sometimes very violent protests that have been taking place by the, quote unquote pro-Palestinian people. I call them pro-Hamas people,
Mm,
anti-American people, including one that took place just a few hours after uh, the terror attack in New Orleans, calling for an intifada, globalize the intifada. Globalize the intifada is what happened in New Orleans. It's, Muslims and to some extent their far leftist allies uh, engaging in acts of violence. And that's what globalizing the intifada means. And that's what they got. And they seem to be happy about it. And people need to wake up to the fact that these are not benign chants that people are doing at quote unquote pro-Palestinian rallies, you frequently see terrorist flags. You see ISIS flags displayed. People need to understand that the movement, and I've been saying this for a long time, particularly since October 7, that people need to understand that the movement against Israel at its core is an anti-American movement. It's an anti-Western civilization movement. It's an anti-capitalist movement. And we're seeing that play out in real time with the protests taking place in the streets, calling for violence, celebrating terrorists, including ISIS, and an ISIS follower committing a mass murder in New Orleans. It's all interconnected. The left loves to talk about intersectionality. Well, talk about the intersectionality of violence and threats to our society that come from the pro-Palestinian movement. It has become, they frequently refer to themselves as the omni cause, that they have managed to link it. No matter what the issue is, it somehow relates to Palestine, they say. Well, unfortunately, no matter what the hatred is, it also seems to relate to Palestine. They carry Palestinian flags at all of these protests calling to tear down the United States, to tear down Western civilization. So people need to wake up to what's going on. It is a serious problem. This might be a one-off, or it might be a precursor to a broader movement in which we see more and more terror attacks.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. Um, Moving on to the next thing, we have an issue that has resurfaced in the headlines this time across the pond, in Europe, with grooming gangs. This is not a story I'm familiar with, so you're gonna have to fill us in on that one.
Yeah. So it's back in the news. It's like, hadn't thought about it in a while, but in the late, do they call them the aughts? What do you call the first decade? It's not the teens, not the 20 teens, 20 aught?
No,
Eight,
yeah, I think it's the odds. Yeah, that used to be a
yeah,
very common way of referring to O, is just
yeah.
or
So
O or
uh, I
zero.
forget the exact year. I think it was 2008, 2009. Uh, there were Pakistani immigrant gangs. Not, they were referred to as gangs. I'm not sure they were organized the way we think of a gang, like but they who would prey upon white English young teenagers and girls, and would engage in mass sexual abuse, mass rape, gang rape, um, repeatedly. They were run amok uh, in many towns and cities in Britain. The police knew about it. The authorities knew about it, but they were all afraid to do anything for fear that they would be accused of being racist, because the perpetrators were non-white and the victims were white, and the details were completely horrific. Many of the girls who were trafficked in that way were from broken families. They had family problems, and there were organized mass sexual assaults on girls in 20 or 30 English towns. The most famous one was Rotherham, uh, but it wasn't just in Rotherham. A lot of people referred to this as Rotherham, but it was more than that. And we're talking several hundred to several thousand girls abused in this way over a multi-year period. There was one report, and I don't think it's just a report, I think it's documented. The police were so negligent and so uncaring that they got a call to a house, and there were two 13-year-old girls naked, drunk and naked in the house with 9 Pakistani immigrants. And who do they arrest? They arrest the girls for being drunk underage. That's how insane it was. Parents who tried to complain were threatened by the gangs and threatened by the police. They were ignored, and it did eventually come out, because I wrote about it in 2014. In 2014, at the blog, a report had come out from Britain describing the extent of this abuse and the cover up. I mean, the crime was bad enough, but the cover up was equally bad. And then it kind of died down. And all of a sudden it's come roaring back, and I'm not 100% sure why. I My understanding is that finally some of the sentencing memos or sentencing transcripts have come to light. And when I say these were bad, I mean these were really bad. What happened? Um, the judge reciting and sentencing people, but the sentences were totally inadequate. Uh, Orders of deportation, they haven't been deported, and now it's come back. Elon Musk took an interest in it. Others, I think there's somebody at the Telegraph who's been writing about this, and that's gotten speed. So it's back, and basically it shows how the multicultural um, ideology, um, you know, allowed horrific crimes not only to take place, but not to be prosecuted, to be ignored, and to be covered up. And so I think a lot of the talk now is about the cover up by the government officials. And so that's what the scandal is. The grooming gangs. Grooming gangs is probably too nice a word for what they did, but it was really bad stuff. And it's coming up again at a very interesting time. I believe the government in power at the time was the Labor government, which is in power now and is like down to like 10% in the poll. I mean, they're failing. There's, several million people have called for elections. Like, what did you think when you elected Labor? Okay. They said they had changed, but everybody knew they hadn't. So that's another one where it's coming up at a very sensitive time in Britain, but it's also in the media here. And I think it will factor into because, in Britain, there's a guy, Tommy Robinson, I believe his name is. He's been sitting in solitary confinement for like 6 months, and he was prosecuted back then. He was complaining about this back in '08 and '09. And of course, he was called a racist, white nationalist, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how they silenced it. They silenced people. And, now he's in prison for saying something unpolitic, not for committing violence. The people who committed these crimes are no longer in prison, but he is. And so it's coming up at a time where Western Europe needs to be reconsidering the mass migration. I think it might be too late for most of Western Europe. If you look what happened on New Year's Eve this year, just like New Year's Eve in prior years, there's a term for it. There's an Islamic term for it that it's basically, I just saw it this morning. It's what had happened in Egypt in Tahrir Square, if you remember, back during the
Mm-hmm.
Egyptian revolution, where they, among other people, targeted. I'm forgetting her name. I think she was at one point at Fox News. Now she's left. Who was a reporter who was abused by a mass crowd. It's basically mass crowds of men isolating women in the mass crowds. So there are thousands of people around you, but you're surrounded, and that's what's been happening in Europe. Many videos coming out of it happened in Germany a couple of years ago on New Year's Eve in a couple of
Mm-hmm.
German cities. It's happening now. So basically, what's coming to a head in the U.S., in Britain, and on the continent is where we were 20 years ago, which is we have an Islamic migration problem which rears its head in violence, rears its head in sexual abuse of women, and there's no controls. And it's different now than it was 20 years ago because in a lot of these European cities, because of unrestricted migration, you're looking at populations that are 10, 20, 30% of the population. It's no longer an isolated minority, and they're almost all single military age men. Europe has a massive, massive problem, which I think it's too late for them. The predictions are in places like the Netherlands and other places by 2050, it's going to be close to majority Muslim societies. Uh,
Well, and I mean, I remember this stuff coming up in the late 2000s. Um, how it was all over the news, and even in the early days of the conservative blogosphere, there would be video upon video of these people talking about how it was their plan to completely overtake the systems of these European countries, particularly in Denmark and Germany and places like that, where they were exploiting open borders with the explicit goal of taking over the country, bleeding the system dry. And, and here we are, not even 20 years later, and that's exactly what's happened. And,
You know,
these countries and societies are all but lost to this.
I mean, we talk all the time about, what 6 months ago was a conspiracy theory now is accepted truth. And this is a thing. People have been saying, listen to what they say. They're
Yeah.
not tricking you. They are not hiding it. The imams, there are videos after videos, the interviews of people on the street. They tell you specifically, our goal is to take over Europe. They
Yeah.
tell you that. And nobody wants to believe it because of political correctness, which might be a polite way of saying it. There are other problems. And they are telling you that their goal is to impose Sharia law in Europe and to take over and turn European states into Islamic states. Uh, doesn't mean they're going to succeed, but believe them that that is their goal. They're telling it to you. Why are you
Right.
ignoring what they're saying? And it's not a conspiracy theory. It's not Islamophobic to document what they say they are going to do, what they say on video they are going to do if they get their numbers up high enough. And uh, there's, uh, I think it's pronounced Gad Saad, and
Yeah.
he's on
He's
Twitter,
all over this issue.
and I
Yeah.
started following him, and I think he's got a podcast in the book, and he calls it suicidal empathy, I think is the term,
Yes.
that we are so
Yes.
empathetic to people that we are willing to be empathetic to people who tell you their goal is to destroy your society.
Yeah.
And I think he's coming out with a book on that. He also, there's another term he uses for it, but basically, it's this phenomenon in the Western world where people who do not hide their intentions tell you what they're going to do to you if they get their way, and you let them do it anyway because you're empathetic towards them, and you're willing to commit societal suicide out of empathy for these people. And so you don't crack down on immigration. You don't crack down on migration. You don't deport people, the imams who are spreading the stuff in the mosques. And you don't do any of this stuff for empathy. And here we know it's, the virtue signaling left. It's the social justice warriors who've done this on campuses. And I think it's all coming to a head. And I think it's coming to a head at the right time, which is Trump coming into office, at least in the US. And I think he will have an impact in Europe as well. It's not the same in Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, they've sealed their borders. They're
Yeah.
not standing for this migration. Yeah, you're going to see a very interesting phenomenon in Europe in 20 years, okay, which the Eastern Europe countries who sealed their borders and got lambasted by the EU for it will be the only surviving cultures, traditional cultures. So every culture is worthy of preserving, except apparently West European cultures. Okay, they're
Right.
not worthy of preserving. And so, yeah, it's coming to a head. I hope it's not too late. I think it's too late for parts of Western Europe, uh, but that doesn't mean they can't make it less bad. And
Right.
they've got it. And the EU has no appetite to crack down on migration. You know, Italy tried to do it. The new prime minister there, she wanted to deport people who are in the country illegally, and some
Hmm.
Italian court said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. It's crazy. Western Europe is committing societal suicide.
Yes. I mean, and of course, there's a whole massive history lesson here, but of course, it started with the European Union, but predated that even. That's just the modern iteration of the
Mm.
problem. But yeah, it's incredibly concerning to see. I mean, because like you said, these people have been telling us on camera for 20 years now this is exactly what they hope to do and plan to do. And at some point, I would hope practicality would reign over empathy, over sympathy. I'm very sorry that people deal with hard things, but it's not our job to take care of anyone and everyone. I mean, it's a pure matter of boundaries. Whether you're looking at this on a micro view at an emotional, relational level, you can't be everything to everyone, or you will cease to be a healthy individual. The same thing applies, on a national or even international level. So I'm hoping that there will be some kind of awakening and a reining in and a more practical way of dealing with things. And quite frankly, we just need backbones. We need people to stand up. We need people to call things as they are. That's my delicate way of saying this. We have other ways of communicating these things down where I live, but it's time for that. It's time for that. The era of trying to pigeonhole men and what they bring to the table as being toxic, this whole idea of toxic masculinity, it needs to be stamped out like for good. And we need people to stand up, show up, and just say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done. So I am hoping that that's, kind of in this cultural pendulum swing that we're seeing and we've talked about in previous episodes with Trump's reelection. I'm hoping that's something we see. I know I'm seeing at least kind of, I guess, what I would call precursors of it, and some of the cultural things that I am aware of online with this whole idea of like traditional families, traditional wifedom, traditional things like that. Well, part of that tradition is men who lead and men who are not punished for doing the things that men should do. So I'm hoping and I'm hopeful that that's part of this resurgence that will help to right much of this stuff that is completely out of alignment, not just here, but globally.
Yeah, I mean,
Because
I
I think,
think Daniel Penny verdict, I think that came in after our last podcast, I'm pretty sure.
I think so,
Um,
yeah.
so Daniel Penny was the guy who came to the defense of people in a subway car where a literal maniac was threatening people, wrestled him to the ground. The guy died. It was disputed whether what the cause of death was. Those were all disputed facts. No dispute. He wrestled him to the ground, and at least for some period of time, put him in a hold. I don't know if it was technically a chokehold. That's actually a term
And
of
no
art.
dispute that the guy that he wrestled to the ground was saying he was going to kill everyone and had done this
Yeah,
like over a
and didn't
dozen
and didn't
times.
yeah. So crazy case, never should have been brought, never would have been brought had it not been a black person who died and a white person who was the perpetrator in this
Yeah.
case, and that caused the activist groups to get involved. So if it wasn't for the that racial component and the activist groups getting involved, it probably never would have been brought. It never should have been brought. It was a very tortured case, the way it came down procedurally, very bizarre, hung jury. Then they dismissed some of the charges. Finally went to the jury on second degree manslaughter, and it was a not guilty finding. But that's what we're facing. And since the Daniel Penny verdict, there have been other incidents on the New York City subways where people are menacing other people and nobody does anything. And so I think that it's this whole culture that why would you come to the defense of people in trouble, even though you're legally allowed to? I mean, the law permits you to use force to protect others, uh, but you're going to get prosecuted by a Soros DA like Alvin Bragg, who's under pressure from the activist groups. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of cultural issues going on here.
Yeah. And I'm,
Well, like
I'm,
I say,
I'm,
thank goodness, really. I mean, think how different things would be if we were talking about Kamala Harris, um, or now that she's lost, I think we can call her Kamala again. Kamala Harris. Administration, what a disaster, what a nightmare it would be on our borders and everywhere. And all these issues we've been talking about, it really annoys me because there's all this little chirping and sniping on the internet, on Twitter, about Trump this and Trump that from people who supposedly back Trump. It's like, can you at least let the guy take office? Okay.
right.
Can you
He
at least
hasn't
let him
even been
take
sworn
office?
in yet.
You need the circular firing squad before he's even taking office. And of course, you have the dummy Republicans in the House who are imploding on each other. Uh, they're going to get into a big fight over who the speaker is going to be. And in the Senate, the only thing Republican senators can seem to organize themselves around is announcing they're going to oppose one of Trump's nominees. Okay.
Truth.
They were very quick to organize 3, 4, 5 people to say, we don't want Pete Hegseth. We don't want whoever it happens to be. Do Democrats ever do that? Of course not. Why can't you just let the process run out? So, we're heading as we head towards Trump's inauguration. Uh, he seems above it in many ways, okay? But all the people below him in the Republican Party are just trying to sabotage everything. It's a total self-own, a self-goal, what they're trying to do. They just can't help themselves.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, 3 weeks, because what, the inauguration's about three-ish weeks,
Not
three and a half.
even. It's
It's the 23rd,
18
20,
days,
yeah.
18 days away.
Gosh, so soon. But also so far away as news cycles go these days. That's an
Yeah,
eternity away
who knows
still.
what Biden's going to pull? I mean,
Right.
this is a very dangerous time,
Yes.
um, because what Obama did a little bit earlier in late December in his second term, when he totally screwed Israel over at the UN. Okay, completely screwed Israel over by refusing to veto one of this continuous crazy Security Council resolutions, did not veto one, basically declaring that anything beyond the 67 boundaries is illegally occupied by Israel, which would include the Jewish quarter of the Old City, would include all sorts of areas. And he let that go through. So he really stuck it to Israel. And I've seen some rumors that Biden's going to do something similar on his way out. And you just, the borders are, uh, who knows what he's going to do there. There have been all sorts of reports that he's struck deals with various unions that guaranteeing that for several years they can work remotely, because one of Trump's plans to shrink the government is make people go to the office. The federal government, I don't know if these are true or not, but I've seen reported statistics that federal office space is only like 10 to 20% actually occupied, because nobody
Yeah.
comes to the office anymore.
And we pay
And
how many
so,
billions of dollars for it?
yeah. And so, this is a dangerous 2 weeks, a very dangerous 2 weeks. And I'm sure Biden's not done yet with his list of pardons.
Oh, I'm sure not. Or whomever's feeding him this stuff, because who knows what Biden's even cognizant of now that we're finally getting some admissions about what we've all known
Yeah.
um, these last 4 years. Um, so to wrap up this very first episode of 2025, predictions for the new year. Do we have any predictions for 2025?
Yeah. Well, first, I probably shouldn't do this, but I'm going to go over what my predictions were for this year to show you. You probably shouldn't listen to my predictions for 2025. Part of this is right. I won't say so. My first prediction for 2024 is Biden will continue to abandon southern border control, right? The surge of economic migrants from around the world will steadily rise to unprecedented numbers. True. Large migrant camps and relocation facilities will arise in blue states with federal funding. That's actually true. They're hotels. So actually, my first prediction wasn't really far off.
Did I make any
This is
predictions last year? I don't even remember.
yes, you. Uh, I would love to pretend I have some idea of what is happening in this dumpster fire of a timeline, but I can predict with certainty that we will acquire more chickens, probably some more animals,
Happened.
and have a more successful garden than last year. I predict an insane and annoying election season. Um, don't trust the polls, so you were right there. Uh,
And the chicken, we did have a garden, but the chickens ate the garden. We definitely had
yeah.
more chickens.
Uh,
So,
So my first prediction kind of came true. This is
yeah.
where I kind of got it half right. 2024 general election will not be Biden versus Trump. That was a pretty bold statement to make in
That
December
was. That was.
2023. One of them, possibly both, is not going to make it. And Biden didn't. Trump came very close to not making it. Okay.
Hmm.
For a variety of reasons, both the criminal cases, which he ended up surviving, and the assassination attempts, which I didn't
Hmm.
predict. But the 2024 contest will be Kamala Harris with Gretchen Whitmer as VP candidate so they can
Whichmer.
get
That's kind of
a, a,
perfect.
a first all-woman ticket versus Ron DeSantis with Glenn Youngkin as VP candidate. Say hello to President-elect DeSantis.
I love it.
Well, I was half right. I mean, I think
Yeah,
that would have played out had, God forbid, Trump, actually been assassinated or had to drop out.
right.
So I wasn't. I'll get half credit. Biden didn't make it. Uh, Here's where I also did not predict well. Trump will be convicted in the Florida case. The others are toss-ups, but likely found not guilty in the other cases. Republicans will take the Senate but lose the House, so I was wrong there. Um, Israel will finish off Hamas and other jihadist terrorists in Gaza. There'll be a gnashing of the teeth, but October 7th was too horrible for Israel to allow it any other way. Um, I thought the brunt of the military offensive would only be 30 to 60 more days. Obviously, it's been longer because Biden has slowed everything down, but it will take several more months to complete as pockets will be involved. So maybe I wasn't that off. It is taking longer than expected. Uh, Unfortunately, few of the remaining hostages will make it out alive. And finally, DEI will not die, but an increasing number of red states will defund. So actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought. Other than predicting President-elect DeSantis, I was actually pretty good.
That was good. That was good. You do have a way and you do have a sense. So that was pretty good. So what about this? Okay, so I did get more chickens. And then we surprise had more chickens. I guess that's what happens when you have a rooster. You just wake up to little cheeping chicks. Um, we did have a more successful garden that was eaten by the chickens, who I thought I'd successfully contained and did not. They sniffed out the tomatoes and ate them all as soon as they were ready to be picked. It was a dumpster fire of a timeline. It remains so. Hopefully, it will be less smoky this year. What else did I say? Crazy election cycle. 100% true. I didn't make any bold predictions though. Those were all, you know, pretty safe. But what about 2025? What are you seeing for this year, or what do you think?
Okay, so we had it on the blog, and here's my predictions for 2025. One, the Iranian Mullah regime will collapse after Israel takes out its nuclear facilities. That will be the opening for a popular revolt, and the cranes in Iran will be very busy. For those who don't know, the Iranians have a habit of hanging people from cranes. So
Mhm.
I think if Israel goes for the nuclear program, I think that will lead to a collapse in Iran. It'll be just a last straw. Um, Biden will unload another massive number of pardons before he leaves office, including family members, J6 committee members, prosecutors, including Jack Smith, and an assortment of people who he believes will be targeted by Trump. Trump will pardon almost all J6 defendants, excepting only the very small number proven to have physically assaulted the police. Federal workers will be ordered to return to the office. 10 to 15% overall will not, higher in some departments, and will quit. Trump will crack down on the border and launch a mass deportation effort, but it will get bogged down in the courts. Nonetheless, it will have an impact as fewer people cross the border and many people leave voluntarily as employment prospects and public assistance dwindle. And last but not least, Trump will target DEI in the executive branch and in education, cutting off programs and funding used for race-based initiatives and eligibility. So those are my predictions for 2025.
So I'll have to go back and add mine in. I just lost all sense of day, time, space, all of that, and forgot to add mine. As I'm thinking of it kind of off the cuff, I mean, like we talked about even just a little bit ago, I'm I am hoping and am hopeful, and I guess I don't want to say I would predict, but that we will start to see a cultural swing as the pendulum does. It's gone so far towards wokeness. I think we're seeing a swing, and I think it's been happening. It just hasn't been in the mainstream. Um, this resurgence of traditionalism. I've been seeing that happen for almost a decade. It's just not been represented widely. What else would I predict for this next year? I think we're going to see a lot more of the type of thing that we saw just yesterday. I do think, we have, I don't want to say sleeper cells, but there are a ton of people that have come into this country. Most are military age single men that we don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they're up to. I think it's safe to assume that there are quite a few dangerous people running around with ill intent. I am very grateful that Trump was reelected, but like we've talked about many times, that's not going to end the problems that we have, because there will be resistance and there will be pushback. And these people are not afraid to get nasty. They're not afraid to get violent. They're not afraid to do very drastic, very violent things. So I think we have to be on guard, and I think we have to remain careful and cautious. I think it's going to be, in some ways, a very good time as we're trying to correct and right things in such a short period of time. I think it's also going to be a lot of unrest and upheaval in the process, because there are a lot of people who have fought very hard for things to be the way they are now. And I don't think they're just going to throw their hands up in the air and say, okay, well, you won the election, so sure, do whatever you want to do. I just don't see that happening. So I think it'll be probably unlike any era we've seen so far. But anyway, so that's, if I have a prediction there, I'm sure we will have more chicks. We just found a chicken roosting in the garage and a bag of old stuffed animals that we had set aside to donate, and she has eggs and she's been sitting, so we may have a few more chicks sometime soon, which is actually the worst possible time for that, since it's about to be very, very cold. But yeah, I think we will also have another very busy year, probably our busiest year yet, at the Legal Insurrection Foundation. I'm very excited about that and everything we have planned and everything we hope to accomplish this year too. So, but that being said, Happy New Year. Thank you for listening. If you do like our content, please click all the buttons, like it, share it, send it to other people. For more information, we do cover all of these stories in great detail on the Legal Insurrection blog, which if you're listening, you can find at legalinsurrection.com. And we will link to the stories of our coverage of what we discussed today. And you can find that information and more at legalinsurrection.com/18. And we hope you'll have a great start to the new year. Don't forget, your New Year's resolutions can be fun and silly, and they don't have to be all about overhauling your entire person or life. So enjoy it. Enjoy the last few days of this very odd and bizarre downtime between Christmas, New Year's, and getting back to real life. So thanks for listening, and we will see y'all next week.